Hello and welcome to Corporate in the Middle. I am your host, Johnny Rivera, where we talk on the show about the challenges and solutions of product and product management and leadership in the trenches. Those who are taking the orders. That's where the rubber meets the road. I'm joined by my good friend, Jenessa Stieglitz. Hello, Jenessa.
Hey.
Jenessa has a great background. I thought it would be really interesting to talk about it. Oh, before we start, I will state that Kyle will not be joining us today. He has some other obligations, but I didn't want to stop the cadence of the show. So we're just going to have a one-on-one conversation today, but he will be back next week with our next guest. Anyway, welcome, Jenessa. Jenessa is a good friend of mine. She has a great background around product management, and it'll be really fun conversation to hear about like those kind of perspectives, especially because today we're going to talk about adventures in data product management and internal tools. So as we know, product management isn't just limited to the products that we see that consumers consume outside that are monetized. There are lots of products that are made to enable those consumer products, those internal tools, and there's a lot of people who are working on those internal products. And so Jenessa has done that for a long time. She has had an interesting journey in terms of product management, especially working on these internal tools. And so I want to be able to talk to Jenessa and get her thoughts on how parts of her journey, what is it that makes it challenging? Maybe she'll come up with some war stories about where she came from, and then like what she plans on doing later, especially in the time of AI, which I mean, we're going to discuss that as well. Everyone has to, and we'll have to see how that affects that. So welcome, Jenessa.
So happy to be here.
I'm glad you're here. All right, let's just kick it off. Let's start off with, let's talk about your journey into product management. I mean, I'm assuming that you were not an 8-year-old sitting down playing with your toys thinking, I want to work on internal tools for a big corporation someday as a product manager. So let's just talk a little bit about your journey and when you were going through your education, what things were you thinking about?
Yeah, at 8, I think I wanted to be a fashion designer and was still making outfits for my Barbies and staging them. So it's been a shift, certainly. So I was lucky enough to graduate with a bachelor's degree in still like somewhat of the tail end of the 2008 recession. And I was going the psych route. And so basically you kind of have like 3 options when you go that route. Either go to grad school, you can stay a nonprofit, or go to grad school for something else. And I ultimately made the decision that any of those options made a lot of sense to me, and ultimately wanted to go the business route, purely born out of enjoying data entry in my nonprofit job. And so went to business school, full-time business school, and just had an opportunity to kind of really like jump in, focus on just that, get a lot of kind of like even local internships. And based on some conversations I had before business school, as well as conversations during, project management really stood out to me. It was interesting. I met people that had that role. And so that was kind of my trajectory. I talked to folks, all across the board who were doing that, construction, technology, joined our local PMI group, got connected with some great mentors there. And so that was kind of what began that journey. I had some opportunities working for a large trucking company, organization in hospitality, kind of doing both like business analysis and, project management, business systems analysis type of work, knowing that was kind of that prerequisite. And then I remember reading and hearing about product management itself and how that career was growing, what it was, what some of the differences were. And that immediately sparked an idea in my mind of wanting to lend myself towards that. So what I did first was really to kind of see what things in my current role could I begin doing. I was certainly responsible for a large, essentially, it touched everything from like this hospitality businesses point of sale system to like all of their back office accounting to all of their membership information. And so I tried to think about that with the software development team that I was partnering with on how could I kind of shift this into that. And on the other side of that, because I'd spent the majority of my career also in analytics, that truly starting with one of my first bosses saying, I need somebody to figure out Tableau, and I just raise my hand. And then you
How
kind of
the
get a
journey
chance.
usually starts. You're
Exactly.
volunteering for
Exactly.
something, and then all of a sudden, oh, wait a minute, I'm taking on something brand new, and yeah, sure, I'm gonna fake it till I make it.
I mean, you just gotta throw yourself in there. I think that's like would be my biggest advice to, like any new grads, any folks early in their career, or even people looking to change their career. Like you have a lot of opportunities to pivot. And I mean, gosh, that was, probably a decade ago. So now it's even easier with AI tools, even easier with folks, making resources available on things like YouTube or, whatever,
Yeah.
TikTok. So, kind of in that and realizing kind of where I wanted to target, went through and kind of began to make some very specific decisions about where I applied to and even also kind of like where I wanted to end up geographically. And that put me
Oh,
in the
where did you start
position.
off? Because this is interesting. I know a little bit about this, but go ahead and relate. Like when you talk about geographically, where were you when you were making these decisions?
Certainly. So I'll state like even geographically as well as where I was like age wise. I think that's like an interesting part of this journey. I was on the West Coast. I lived on the West Coast my whole life. I was ultimately interested in moving to a bigger market. Felt like from not only just a work perspective, but from like different personal goals I had, I was going to be
Yeah.
able to do much more successfully in, a larger market on the East Coast or even in the Midwest. And so that was kind of also what was, highlighting my direction. But I was also in the place where I was in my late 20s and was really asking myself questions of do I see the kinds of people and opportunities that I want to be around where I'm at
Mm.
currently? And on a lot of fronts, the answer just came back no.
Mm. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Just so everyone knows, we're in Portland, Oregon right now, but because you live down the street from me, so that's easy. Kyle, on the other hand, is in Colorado, and we worked in a company that we're remote, so we have different perspectives. Previous episode, we spoke to one of our old coworkers, and she's outside of Chicago, so we're getting a lot of different regional perspectives. That's the reason why I bring it up, is because you coming from somewhere in California and on the West Coast, and you're trying to look for a bigger market, you could have went to places like LA or Boston or New York. So then you came to Portland, Oregon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's where I started my career, and to be honest, I think now in the age of remote but also like more of a hybrid approach, it, it's it's less about the location. I mean, again, I think maybe I'll shift it this way. I had a friend that is moving back east. She was out here for a number of years, and we worked at the same company. And what I'm so excited for her about is the fact that she'll be able to just be around a lot more like-minded folks. She
Mm.
is East Coast person through and through,
Let's go.
and I'm
Born
I'm
and
just
raised Massachusetts.
right, right. Yeah, it's funny, it's Boston. I'm just encouraged for her and what I think like how she'll be able to thrive even more. I mean, this comes down to like communication styles. She was very blunt, very direct. And on the
Oh
West
yeah.
Coast, I would specifically say in the Pacific Northwest, that
Mm-hmm.
is going to be
Mm-hmm.
read a very different way than it would on the East Cost. And I'll make an exception for California as well.
That's a very interesting point because that has been one of the harder transitions for me. I have been I'm a very personable person, and at least I like to think so, and I like to be engaged and talk with people. But I have been told on more than one occasion that my communication style is a little more abrupt, a little more upfront. I don't want to say honest because that's not the right word, but more like I wouldn't sit there and be rude to somebody, but when we're starting to talk about problems, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We're just going to have a discussion. I'm open to hearing both sides. I think in the on Pacific Northwest, communication around, okay, we have a problem we need to solve. Let's try and solve it. There's a lot of dancing around a person's feelings and a person's views, and we have to like take some time out, and that you don't always have that luxury, so it comes off as a little more abrasive as I would like it to be. So I can totally feel that coming from the East Coast. It's okay. So you say all these things, and so you ended up here. And then how was your product journey? It sounded like you were on the path of internal tools when we're talking about membership data roles and accounting and things like there was like a little bit of sprinkling of internal tooling here. So it's not like you were out there creating the next killer app. So tell us about how you were in the last few years. What was your job situation like?
Yeah, I've been lucky enough to always kind of be situated more on that internal tooling piece. And, I can say lucky now, and I think I still actually need it. May not have believed that before. But in realizing that ultimately you still have a customer. And in an interesting way, that customer is dependent, like you're dependent on their success in a very different way than in an external customer. Someone at Meta responsible for search, sure, their customer wants to be able to, find find their grandma or whatever on there. But it's a little bit more detached as compared to, hey, I'm providing finance data, and the faster that finance is able to grasp that means they can make quicker decisions, they can make better decisions. And that ultimately is going to, like, really bottom line impact both of us, like keeping our jobs, doing more, growing more. So yeah, it's, I've had a couple of roles where I've been responsible for more pieces on the software side. But anytime you say that, there's always going to be an analytics component. Like ultimately, it's columns and rows, and folks are going to want to manipulate that. Folks are going to want to be able to do things all the way from like self-serve to like very complex reports that land on their desk, land on their email on a Sunday night.
Yeah. So you were more focused, would you say, in those portions on the analytics and data side, or were you doing just a mix of things? Like where was the majority of the work that you were doing?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I kind of continue to fall, I think, at the intersection of both, which is what I would highly recommend for anyone who is in this space, making sure that you're kind of touching both. So you're able to, speak well of and understand how to, ultimately manipulate tools like Power BI, Tableau, Domo, etc. And manipulate it in such a way that it's getting after those business objectives. But where I'm kind of continuing to see the industry go is more on the data side and more on the, again, like intersection of both. So being able to kind of not just have an engineer, can do a query and you can run that in any one of those visualization tools. It's okay, why are we choosing Snowflake rather than Databricks? Why do we go a Lakehouse route versus just let's just keep things consistent, data lake? And you kind of think about that for like a couple of different reasons. I think one being really building solid trust with your team specifically. So, and that looks like, engineering management, the individual engineers on your team. And then I think second fold, it gives you the full, like, bigger picture. Not only are you able to solve problems easier, you're able to better design and suggest solutions as you go through the build process, having discovered kind of what the real problem is. You can then really state, okay, this actually makes a lot more sense here versus we make a different decision over here.
Yeah, that's interesting. You brought up a couple of things that I was thinking about as you were talking. First is like the sections of, well, one is the importance of data. Let's start with that, right? I think that's really interesting when you're talking about you got to focus in on the data. I think we've all heard the term garbage in, garbage out when it comes to data, right? Like you got to have good data when you're reporting. You got to have good data. And this we could tie into AI, right? Where, which is the reason why I'm bringing it up, is because even though the models out there are really fast and effective, it really depends on what information you feed it, right? Because it only can answer the questions that you ask for, right? It's not some sort of entity that can intuit what you want, which is where I think product managers, their greatest success lies. When you go and you talk to customers or what you're trying to understand from them, like knowing the business and the strategy, you've got to understand those portions in order for you to be able to extract the information that you need, right? The right information. So I thought that was interesting. When we get to AI and we talk about your journey there, I think that will be fascinating to turn that around and talk a little bit more. Another thing I thought was interesting is you were talking through the tooling. So I got a question. I was wondering, I'll set the stage. One of the things I think is a huge challenge, especially in the middle, when you're talking to a product or project manager now, is the inability to have full ownership of your products. And I think we are all challenged by this, and it's not talked about enough. So how can you get over those sort of things? So in your particular experience, you talked about like, oh, you got to be able to use Snowflake, you got to be able to use these tools, Power BI, whatever. How much ownership did you have over your products in terms of choosing tooling or strategy of implementation?
I would say pretty minimal. When you're looking at these, especially really large corporations, they've more or less decided based on deals. There's less savory reasons, we don't need to go there, as to why kind of that tool set is there. I've had the opportunity to sit in on demos in terms of what we would buy and ultimately integrate. I think where there's a bit more leniency, a bit more optionality is really on that build side. Hey, it does this piece, not we're stuck with it, but it does this piece, but we still need it to talk to these other things, or there's going to be some type of gap potentially. And so, I think in an interesting way, it's getting comfortable with that surrender. I'll be curious to see as you continue in this series, as you talk to other PMs, if their answer is similar, just because you have so many, even just stakeholders at the table. But anyways, I think kind of going back to just the idea of like relinquishing the control. That's, I think, a life philosophy anyways, is just relinquishing.
I think the simplest way to put it is you can control what you can control, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think you can find autonomy in the areas you're talking about, right? Because it is important, as we want to be self-actualized humans here, right? We are trying to contribute our best experiences, using our experiences and our insight to be able to create the best products. It's not like we're intentionally doing things to create something poor for another person to consume. We're proud of those things, right? So saying all of that, I do believe that there is a way where you can create autonomy and you can make good decisions, and implementation, configuration, things like that you were talking about are definitely ways to do that. I do believe that like the interesting part of saying that, though, is like I've stated in the beginning, I don't think there's a lot of people who really understand where that autonomy comes from. You think that as a product leader, you will have this kind of influence, right? To say, I want to choose this larger package or whatever. But you're right. You have to surrender to the leadership, and whatever they give you, you're going to do it, right? And so you can find autonomy. I think that's where I've found success personally, where I know that I don't have full control over a product, but I ensure that my team gets as much autonomy as they possibly can. I ensure that I can exert my influence in the configuration. So very similar to what you're saying. Like I said, I just don't think we talk about it enough. And we run into a lot of times where people will speak negatively about those things because they don't have the control that they want. And that's really tough as humans. Like we want to control the things that we can control, right? Or at least as much as we can. So along those lines, there's challenges, obviously, working with products, creating products for people, trying to understand the business, as an example, managing the stakeholders, whether it's on the business side or the consumer side. But I wondered if there were some things that you found challenging with internal tools. What is it that you find the most challenging aspects of working in internal tools versus, say, a product for consumers?
I think the biggest piece I continue to run up against is trust. Building trust, ensuring trust, maintaining trust. You can present the prettiest, most technologically fancy data product, But if you've got, some user who is expecting to see a number with a certain number of zeros and yours doesn't, it doesn't matter. It's moot at that point, which is really, really frustrating. But I like to think of that. I like to think that that's one of those pieces where you actually do have more control than you don't. I think that's really where it comes in. How do you approach the relationship? How do you understand the adoption journey? How do you think about enterprise products at scale and their life cycle?
Yeah.
I think that's another interesting one as well. Knowing that it is a life cycle, you should not build something with the idea that it will live forever. There's a lot of hubris in that statement. There's a lot of
I think
hubris.
that is a very cogent statement, honestly. I have thoughts. I'll let you continue, but
Yeah.
that's incredibly valid.
And so what would the exit journey look like? What would the maturation journey of these users look like? I mean, many years ago, everyone snowflake, snowflake, snowflake. Now I'm not hearing that as much anymore. It's much more on the Databricks lens. And there's a lot of time and energy, money, other resources spent on just transitioning products to that. And so as you're doing those builds, are you even thinking about that as a baseline? There's a much more like philosophical way to think about that as well. There's another part of that question that I was gonna get to. Oh, okay. Yeah. So I think also on the trust side, that is where we can really start to talk about AI.
Okay.
So again, same piece, garbage in, garbage out. So if you're feeding it something, which a little bit of the kind of the part that I think a lot of folks that have been in this space for a while, slapping a starry logo on really large enterprise systems, you're like, this is held together
Mailing
with
wire. That's
duct
my
tape
favorite.
and
That's my favorite
wishes.
term.
Like it's and so we can say this among friends, but like you can't really get mad at the AI for hallucinating when what it was given to eat was a
True.
mirage anyways. I'm a big doctor of metaphors. So you'll hear me say things like that
I
a
love
lot.
metaphors. I love it. Let's do it. Let's do it. So what I think is interesting about what you talk about with AI is it is not much different than any kind of other technology change, not technology leap, because that's a different question, but technology change that we come across in businesses, right? For instance, you just spoke about the example of like being in an organization where they decided they were like Snowflake was numero uno, the number one. This is the best thing in the world. And then all of a sudden, a few years later, they're like, oh my God, we need to get off of Snowflake and get onto Databricks. This is not different throughout the entire technology, lifespan. When we were talking about the internet from
Yeah.
the beginning all the way up to now to AI, it was always the same thing. I've seen people proselytizing about how cloud technology is going to, make it like the best thing in the world. We got to do it. We got to do it. And then someone comes knocking on your door saying, "Hey, you're spending too much on cloud costs. What are you doing?" Even though you were giving free reign to be able to do so. That systems thinking, I'm going to go down and say about the life cycle, like understanding where you are and at what point you need to transition is so vital for a product manager. And you are spot on about it. Like you need to know where you are in terms of your product's journey, right? Because there's going to come to a point where, when they say cradle to grave, there is literally a grave. Someone's going to pull the plug on that technology
Yeah.
for you, or something else that's going to come out that's just going to revolutionize it, just like with AI. And so like you've got to be prepared for that. And so I think it's very interesting, and I like what you're saying about like you've got to know the life cycle, and then when you get to AI, you're like, okay, look, I know that it requires good data. Let's make sure that it gets good data in. You can't just slap AI on something and think it's going to change everything. That's not how it works. And that, like, I've learned a little bit about the underpinnings of AI and like the architecture and the structure. The LLM is not some all-seeing God. It is trained, it is put together, it's curated, and it's getting more powerful day by day. But in the end, it's still just what it is. That's why there's a huge difference between Grok, and there's a huge difference between Claude, and there's a huge difference between Copilot, because all these guys are trained on different ways. They're
Yeah.
almost like humans in the sense that they're raised differently. Like you could be raised as a child in the East Coast and have an abrupt personality, or you could be trained, or raised by, in Silicon Valley, and, like you're more adept to being pleasant, as all these models are. They love to gas you up, these models. They're doing a lot of glazing. Great job, Jenessa. You're awesome. I love that response. And we all have seen it. But the whole idea is that all of them are trained differently. And so you, as a product manager, have to understand, how can you put this into play? How can you ensure that the strategic implementation of this will be able to satisfy your consumers in the very beginning and be able to be sustainable? And that's like no different for internal products. Mm-hmm. So I totally agree with
Absolutely.
that. I think it's great. You mentioned trust. I wanted to talk a little bit about that because trust. I would say my hot take around product and project management is, I think it's 80% people management, 20% technical management, because it has so much influence. You're dealing with people. You're not dealing with the robots, right? And so as a product leader versus a project leader, right? As a product leader, influence is enormous. You need to get your staff and your team behind you to be able to execute on the operations of leadership and strategy from leadership. You've got to convince leadership that you're going in the right direction. And these are all people with their own personalities and their own agendas. And so cultivating that trust is more than just performing. It's, or performing well. It is ensuring that you give the right data. One thing you mentioned earlier, which I think is absolutely true, is, when someone sees, you give them a report and it's supposed to have 5 zeros behind it, and instead it only has 4, that's a big deal. When you give them numbers, and it's only one little thing, and it can taint the entire batch. It doesn't matter that you have a sparkling new toy that you want to show them. If you show them that data and it's not correct in some way, they'll lose trust. And so that's a big line that you have to toe. So when you are working with your customers, like how are you, first of all, building that trust? What are things that you find have been effective for you to build trust? And then how do you conduct your consumer research in order to understand them so that you can make that connection to the trust?
Certainly. And I think it really begins with just the relationship building, fundamental blocks from demonstrating you care about this person. This person matters, and what they have to say matters to you. Because I think on the interesting piece, when you would be going through discovery, they have to trust you enough to tell you what's really going on. The honest answer that is likely putting them in a very vulnerable position. And, you're also sharing a bit as well, hey, you're in this vulnerable place as well. Hey, maybe we're bound to this certain tech stack, or bound to hitting a certain deadline that's going to require just some challenge, going to require a hit against resources. And so if you can do that and maintain that, it is so unbelievably foundational, but it's also the actual framing of the house itself too. Okay, yeah, we got to start there, but we can't even then build anything on top of that if that trust isn't ongoing, isn't regular, which will also include, again, moments of vulnerability, admitting when you're wrong, because you will make mistakes. That's unavoidable. It's kind of comforting.
I like that you said that it's
once you can admit that
you're vulnerable with your consumer, your stakeholder. I think that's so true, right? Because you're vulnerable as a product owner, like a product leader, by stating that, hey, look, I'm going to help you. I'm going to do these things, and you're trying to get to their understanding of where they're at in their journey, right? And they're vulnerable because they have to admit when things aren't correct. And it's 100% valid that you are constrained and challenged by very similar things. We're stuck with this tech stack. We have a deadline we have to meet. We both are answering to the same people. That is that connection where you make with your stakeholders is huge, right? It allows you to be able to come up with some great ideas around how do you make sure that they get what they need while at the same time executing on business strategy, especially when things are moving as quick. I mean, they've always moved quickly, right? But right now it's even more quick, right? That we're bombarded. Again, we'll go back to the AI thing. It is important that, as a product leader, you need to ensure that you're instituting this technology and making it available to you and your consumers because you want to make a better product. So how are you, like we were talking about a little bit about interacting with the consumers or stakeholders, but I really want to touch on your process a little bit more about how do you conduct your consumer research. I'll frame it in the sense that if you're making an external product, it's pretty easy to state that, hey, I am going to sell product product A to a company, right? I'm a C2C or I'm a B2C. Like you have a customer, you have a stakeholder that is buying this product and you want to make sure that they continue to buy the product. But it's a little different when you have internal tools where they're consuming those tools, but they're not necessarily buying that from you, right? So you don't have the same metrics. So in order for you to try to work with these internal teams in a way that like produces good products, like how do you conduct your consumer stakeholder your stakeholders research?
I think one of the ways I found to be most helpful is having kind of the different user groups effectively walk you through their process. And that might be like, what is their existing tool? It might just be something in Excel, because you'll really get to see the specific pain points that might not come to mind just as you're doing like a traditional user interview. Or even just connecting with them, meeting like, okay, hey, we've got these priorities. When they actually walk you through the process, you're able to see things as simple as like, oh, putting that button on this side versus the other is not that intuitive. Or they think they want like self-serve, but what they're really looking for is something more in the middle. It really brings a lot of that to light. I think also in kind of that discovery process, it helps you to, as much as possible, inform those tech decisions. So, hey, why would we be spending so much money on this cloud computing piece if no one is really going to use it? Or, oh, this is not a very efficient way to drive this piece that they're looking to do. I'm thinking back to something I read in a Marty Kagan book, specifically talking about also your development teams really know the product itself. Giving them as much of a green field to build from is so crucial. And so I think that's also why I really stress the importance of bringing those team members along with you. Not only is it going to help kind of create new ideas, and I'll caution, sometimes you have to kind of pre-read it and kind of say, hey, this isn't a solutioning discussion. This is a listening tour.
How many times I've been in a conversation where I'm like, can we not solution this now? Can we just, because engineers will get very eager, which is totally valid. I think that's great. But engineers will get super eager and they're like, oh yeah, we could fix that by doing X, Y, Z. I'm like, oh, can we just define the problem first?
Right. Yeah. It's like, we respect that. We totally respect that brain. And I think I like to see it as it's an opportunity for them to mature, but I think also an opportunity for me to mature as well in, how I'm clearly communicating that. But I think one of the, even I would say, more important benefits you get out of that is your team really gets to connect to the why. Why are they doing this? Whether it's understanding parts of the supply chain, whether it's understanding, okay, here's how product recommendations actually work. You can start to see kind of the sparkle in their eye. And it's jet fuel. That's you can't buy that kind of productivity. You can't buy that kind of mindset. They really have to understand the why. And so getting it from them, you continuing to reinforce it, just accelerates that.
I am a big fan of that old Simon Sinek TED Talk where he talked about the Apple design process and getting to the why. And I really appreciate that, right? We as humans generally are not going to just do something for the sake of doing it, right? A lot of times we want to know why we're doing those things, even if it's on a basic level, like, if I want to go and help somebody out, like, why am I helping them out? Like, oh, because they're my neighbor. I want to be able to help them out. Or, I feel like I'm contributing to society by helping out. Like, those are like broad, general things. But on a strategic level, or a tactical level, I should say, in a corporation, these guys are writing code, you're creating documentation, you're enabling strategy. And the worst thing that you can have is sitting there in front of a blank page or a blank screen and wondering, why the hell am I here? Why am I doing this? Right? That is like the worst feeling in the world. Yeah. And so even if it's on a micro level, we're a developer. I've been in many, many, many developer meetings, right, where I'm talking to my team and we're talking about stuff. And then there's like that one guy is like, why the hell are we doing this? What is the point of doing this at all? And that question, like, you're right. It's like jet fuel. If you can get them on the positive side, boom, you got their motivation. They're going to be up and going and they're going to be producing and their productivity is going to spike. But if they don't have any idea what's going on or why they're doing it, or like, the strategic initiative doesn't make sense to them, that's going to just be a millstone on them instead, right? And it's just going to drag your development along. So I really like that. I really like what you're saying about that because it makes total sense, right? For me personally, I've always enjoyed, because you brought up Marty Kagan, Teresa Torres, and she developed this kind of structure and reinforced it framework called continuous discovery techniques, and that was eye-opening for me, right? Because that helps you to dig into the why, like interviewing your customers, engaging with your stakeholders, making sure that the people are connected in the right ways, like your developers are connected in the right ways, making sure that you're getting the right information, really digs into the why. Because once you have a good understanding or shared understanding even with your stakeholder, you're going to be much more successful. So I appreciated that. I thought that was good. Talking about the why, it's an interesting transition because I'm curious about this, and I've had my own experiences, but I'm curious about you. All right, you've got something that you're going to work with your team on, right? And as an example, you're just like, hey, we've got this internal tool we're going to be working on, and one of the things that I have found challenging, and I'm curious if you have as well, is around the strategy of these things because they don't have the same impact to the bottom line. Obviously, like internal tools tend to be a money sink, not a money maker, right? They're an enabler, but they're not a direct maker of the bottom line. So I'm curious to you, like, how have you received your strategy over the last few years from your leaders around these internal tools? And have you been able to internalize that why on why these things are needed? And, what's your journey been like?
Certainly. I mean, it's interesting to have watched, I think, even just the journey over the last 5 years. I think right now, again, we're so much in a big AI boom, regardless of whether that's integrating that or just being like AI native. But, during certain times, it's really about, like driving down costs or increasing efficiencies. And I think what I've always found really helpful as I kind of wrap my brain around those is like getting down to the actual numbers themselves. If you're lucky enough to work for a publicly traded company, look at the balance sheet. Like, it is fascinating to observe that. It's, very easy to also, if you digest information in a different way, it's always very easy to kind of find visuals where they're breaking out, revenue versus expenses. So getting a real, like, actual understanding of that, and it's like, I'm always just so inclined to lead towards the money component.
Yeah, I mean, that's what drives the business, right? So it makes a ton of sense.
It ultimately is, and there are things like, hey, time to insight. Sure, that's ultimately going to bring about, more revenue. Hey, maybe in certain cases that could bring about ultimately more profit because you were able to distribute, workloads differently, but even more so. And I think back to kind of like the way that you phrase this question, you're really wanting to look at like your outcome, how that directly lines lines up to the strategy, but specifically like monetarily. If you're able to say like, hey, yeah, I made this improvement by bringing in this additional data set. Now folks are planning all against that. And yes, that brought about, $1.6 million in revenue in the specific time period. Like that's really what matters, what like
I think it's really
ultimately makes a
challenging
big impact.
to kind of like justify those things with those kind of numbers, especially with internal tooling. Like internal tooling is absolutely needed. They are enablers, but we're not, well, I shouldn't say we not. I'll say as a product manager working on a lot of internal tools, I haven't seen the direct strategy on a lot of these things. And it was troubling to me because I, like you, think like that. Like I want to be contributing. I want to see how much I'm contributing and how that works. And so it makes it very difficult. I worked for an education software company, and I'll give an example of like where it got lost for us. I worked for an education software company where I worked at the API level. The end of the line of this product presented test results. My team's job was to serve up test results via an API and multiple APIs. And so it was a vital component for either the internal teams to understand how to get that data and then rework that within their curriculum, or for external users, which this was really interesting, which I felt like I was so close, but not there. We had external clients that were taking our test result data and creating curriculum from that. But the problem is that we weren't directly connected to that. So even though we served them up the test results, they then took that data and did something with it, and then they went their way and created an external facing product. In the end, the company was very concerned with the revenue around how much information we were giving to the data, right? And they were selling that, but we didn't have a direct impact on it. And even though we were serving it all up. And so when we tried to institute changes that would make this better and then make it so that, we connected to rostering, for instance, it was to make it easier. Like we didn't have any of that information to understand, hey, you're selling this data for this much and we're providing it. We were like almost like a pump or a spigot, if I were to use an analogy of this information, but you're metering it, but we're not seeing the metering. We don't know how much you're charging. We don't know how these people are using it. As a side note, it was kind of interesting. I was in a sprint review one time, and we're highly technical. We're like, yeah, we're serving up these test results. We're making these APIs. We introduced these methods during the sprint, and they were like, yeah, so you're working with Khan Academy, right? And I'm like, yeah. I mean, we're giving it to Khan Academy. And like, okay, what's Khan Academy doing with it? And I'm like, I don't know what Khan Academy is doing. I'm not on Khan Academy's team. Like, what do you mean? What is Khan Academy doing? They're like, well, it would have been nice to see what curriculum they're creating from your data. And I'm like, that's not where I am. I'm like an internal tool. I'm providing the infrastructure for you to serve this up to Khan Academy so they can create their things. But unfortunately, on our stakeholders, like our leaders, were like, yeah, that's kind of boring. I don't care about that. And so I was a little bit like disappointed by the fact that like, oh, I wish we could have been more connected, so that's why that's where the heart of the question comes from is, how are you served up this strategy? Were you just told that it's something that you should do? That's been the case for me, especially with internal tooling. Or is it like, hey, we're enabling these things and we want you to be part of the process because you may be the spigot and we're metering the water, but like we're filling up a dam, for instance, and here this is how we're doing it. And so internal tooling, it's always been a challenge for me. Even though I love working with those stakeholders, it's just, I wish I was a little more connected to that overall strategy.
I think that's a totally fair point, and it like requires you to look at things differently. It requires you to kind of almost be like an existential detective of like, okay, how am I deriving meaning? How am I deriving an outcome? I think in the example you just shared, what would be the cost of them using just like an out of the box API solution versus y'all building it internally? Like that's just like one specific way. Also, like the outcome, whatever that dollar amount ended up being, that PM at the end of the road, you get a chunk of that. Sure. You absolutely should claim a chunk of that. But I think in the internal piece, it's again really looking at costs and how are you optimizing against those? How are you, okay, hey, it might be cheaper for you to go with, more of an out of the box solution, but you will lose all this customization. And we've got like X many number of people using that piece that
Yeah,
the
the
customization allows.
ownership part of the conversation comes into this too. We were a highly matrixed organization, so like, and this was several years ago, many years ago for me, and I didn't understand the impact of a highly matrixed organization when you have multiple layers, and like we were far away from the layer that actually knew that information, and it was. It's just a little disappointing because again, it goes back to the meaning thing. It goes back to the ownership thing. Like, why are you doing it? You're going to be much more motivated. And they weren't our only customer. That was our way for doing in like an external customer for us. But most of our work was feeding that information back into our internal systems, right? So that they can create the curriculum. And I think it's super important. I guess I want to reemphasize that, right? It's super important to understand the why. Even with internal tooling, it is super important to be connected so that you can be motivated. And, I hope as part of my journey here, especially talking with different people in different places, like how we can be more connected. I'm going to think about that as we go through, like how do we become more connected with the things that we're doing and prove our worth? Because that's a big thing too, is ultimately, if you are not as connected, like you said, like you can claim a bunch of that, but like if you can't put any kind of real tangible information to it, it's very difficult to say that you are part of it. And so I find that fascinating. I want to switch gears a little bit more on the technical side. We talked a lot about the stakeholder management portions of this, but like on the technical side, I know that you wanted to discuss a little bit more about how to be more data driven. And so in your experience and what you've been doing, like tell me about how you have been as a product manager, been more data driven, especially with these internal tools.
Interesting. I think kind of one of the reasons I brought this up as a topic is you run into that phrase so much, even if maybe you're looking for specific roles like that, those filters will grab that and say, oh yeah, this is a data PM role. And you're like, no, it's just being data driven. So keep that in mind as you go through this process, because it's definitely it's different. There have been plenty of PMs that I work with that I would describe as data driven, but the source of the data that they were using was correct for their business unit, and it was costly for that business unit to have that data. But I can't take away that like these folks were making data driven decisions. So I think for folks in the data and analytics space, it's much more about this really, I think, does go back to the trust itself. So how are you understanding the entire pipeline process? How is it orchestrated, implemented, even just from raw ingestion to what different transformations is it going through, so that you can confidently speak to, yes, I do trust this data. I'm going to make decisions off of it. And I also encourage you to make decisions off of it. I think the other real great benefit about that is it further engenders trust with your development team.
Obviously, I think data is a huge component, right? Obviously, we need data to drive our decisions. We don't just create things just to create things. We don't manage things just to manage things. One of the best mindsets you can have is to have that iterative mindset where you take the information, you quickly act on it, and then you do the next best thing you can do. Right. So being data driven makes a ton of sense to me. Obviously, I agree with you as well. But with that data itself, I mean, so let me ask you, in terms of your experience, if you worked mostly with financial organizations, or have you worked in terms of your reporting and the platform's internal tools you're reporting, or have you worked in a variety of places where data is obviously important, but it's not of a financial nature?
I have been lucky enough to work across so many different business units. So financial absolutely being one of them, sales, supply chain information as well, purchase orders, but also things like, kind of just like digital experiences, consumer pathways, to, to even, those that are, kind of trying to drive better experiences across those digital experiences. But even, I think even to just like, okay, how would a checkout flow operate, and how would we ultimately capture that data? How do we define this?
I see a lot of positions for like master data management kind of thing. Have you done that? Worked in an had a position where you had to create master data for things? That's interesting work too, because like I know in the retail space, I had a friend who worked for Columbia, and his whole thing in the beginning of his career was ensuring that a lot of this data matched up around like SKU numbers and like how they were shipped and bill ladings, and then like ensuring that they matched up with the right parameters. There's always a SKU, and then there's like underneath that SKU there's like colors of jackets or like clothes and things like that. And organizing that, I mean, this was 8-9 years ago. That was a human like manual labor task. I think today it's probably not, based on our advancements. But did you have to do that sort of thing, or is it more like reporting on the supply chain and ensuring that the flow works correcttly?
I've gotten closer to that data more on the reporting side. And kind of, again, as I mentioned, my approach has been to at least ensure that I'm understanding, where this is coming from. Okay, that's from SAP, that it's going through a certain amount of transformations, and those transformations are taking time. But yeah, I can remember some of the early database administrators in my career. And yeah, it's fascinating to see how that has changed and evolved.
Yeah, it's
so
crazy. All right,
so quickly.
We'll start to ask a couple of like a couple more questions toward the end of this conversation that I'm curious about, and I liked the topic that you wanted to bring up. So we'll ask this one here: is what kind of metrics are you tracking towards? So you wrote this down as part of our show notes, and I think this one is a really important question because it's something tangible that people can take with them, and especially if you have experiences with that. So I'm just curious about what was it that you were thinking about when you put that in?
Certainly, and we touched on this a bit, but I think a component of this, to like drill in a bit more, is there are going to be places where your metrics will match what maybe different kind of product management is doing. I think those are certainly helpful. Things like product adoption rate, even going back to your typical like NPS. But deeply underscoring the importance of cost. So you should always be asking yourself that, because you are going to be asked that. Hey, again, how performant are our queries? How much what is latency costing us? Should we go after data freshness more? Is that, what is that going to cost us? Because that will enable you to really serve those internal customers well, which in this case, well means they're able to do their jobs better, but also you both get to take a share in the revenue that was ultimately produced by them being able to do their jobs better, because you both work for the same organization and you're doing it more performantly. You're doing it, in a, easier to access way, or you're doing it in a way that allows for there to be, I think, kind of a growth of adoption. Certainly want to make it pretty, but that might not be as as great concern. There can be kind of more adoption.
Trust goes a long way, like you were talking about, in adoption. If somebody can't trust something, it doesn't matter how beautiful it is. It's not going to be trusted, and I agree with that. Interestingly, I think it's funny with internal tools. It's almost like forced adoption, but in the sense that they got to use the internal tool. But I do think that there's a lot that a product manager can do to enable and internalize and enable that strategy, right? The strategy is you're going to take on that work, you're going to do this thing for these people, and you're going to make it so that their lives are easier, right? And there's a lot, I think there's a lot of power in that, which is what appeals to me as a product manager, right? I like, even if it's internal tools, I want to make sure that this tool is built in such a way that makes sense for the people using it. Yeah, I've worked with engineers where they take for granted, and it's not their fault. It's just they just don't understand the entire strategy, right? They're not looking at it from like the higher level, but they take for granted the fact that something works, and then somebody else is using it. And I try to get the engineers to be like, just think about how you would want to use an internal tool if you were to access, I don't know, Google's API, right? Do you want it to be sparse documentation? No, you want it to be good documentation, right? You want to be able to have a good experience when using it. Do you want something to be flaky when you're trying to access, like whatever it is that they're using? Do you want that to be flaky and not work? No, you want it to work. And even on a personal experience, like you don't want to turn on your television and find out that Netflix isn't working because they have a server down, and they're like, oh yeah, it'll come up later. Like nobody wants that experience, right? And so that's exactly what it leads to for me. Like I like that even in internal tools, you have to like internalize that strategy. You have to make sure you do that. So it makes a ton of sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, it's interesting you say like that forced adoption, because I mean, I've been around plenty of, like larger product launches. They're not adopting it. Like
Yeah.
they do not care. Like they're spinning up something else that lets them do what they want to do. They're, building it in Excel.
Yeah.
It's
The Excel
it's not.
alternative is hilarious. I see that especially in finance, but
Yeah.
it happens in a lot of places, right? Where, Mary from accounting has a report that she does in Excel and everyone loves it because it gives the data that they trust. And then so the organization says, we should build an internal tool for that so that it's not, just sitting on Mary's desk. And then we go through the motions of putting it all together and then putting it in there. And we think it's forced adoption, but everyone just goes back to Mary's spreadsheet.
Exactly, exactly. Well, and it's funny when you bring it back to trust. Like, yeah, finance trusts
Yeah.
Excel. Like that is numbers that they can manipulate, they can work within. And like in those cases, hey, did we stop and ask what are we driving by replacing Mary's spreadsheet with an internal tool? Like, what savings are we getting? How are we thinking about this in the long term in terms of supportability? Yes, we get this out of her desk.
This is a great transition to AI because AI is the same kind of way. It even though it's using natural language to communicate with us, and it feels like we're talking to a person. It is not a person. It's not talking and thinking like a person. It's a for its simplest terms, a prediction algorithm of the next word. And so implementing these things, it's very difficult because we think if we just layer this thing on top of it, it'll be fine. But then it erodes the trust, right? Because then people don't use it because they're like, why would I use this, right?
Yeah.
So I find it fascinating. It's interesting how it all comes back to I still think it's like 80% people management, 20% technical, but that's the way it is. All right. So along the lines of the AI thing, especially in product management, with that and that focus, like how we'll break this up into two sections. One, like what do you think those impacts are right now on your day-to-day work, and has it impacted you? I know you worked for a large organization before and that they were trying to adopt AI, but it may not have reached you yet, because we are a very high person-to-person role. And then what do you want to work on when in the next 5 years? If we have this conversation in 5 years, what will be the things that you would have wanted to say, yeah, I worked on these sort of things? So we'll start with the AI portion first.
Certainly, and gosh, I'm tempted to just answer more of the latter part of your question. So I'll just lead into the temptation. Starting with a quote I remember early in my product management journey from a mentor. This concept of leaving things better than
Yeah,
how you
isn't that a
found
Boy
them,
Scout
and
thing? That's a Boy Scout
I
mantra.
I
Yeah.
believe so. I believe so, but I loved it. I think this gal worked in like video games, but I love applying this specifically to AI. We're having this conversation in mid-May of 2026. Yesterday, the like Musk OpenAI case was
Yeah.
was dismissed. And then at the same time, it looks like SpaceX is looking to move very quickly and IPO very shortly. So they might be the first ones to effectively have like a public view into how AI is actually performing. So you can speculate wildly, but if I were to look at like where I want to be in 5 years, it would be the true like responsible use of that. You know, you mentioned Grok, and I think that's, I mean, like one complete end of the spectrum. But if you look at it of even like the expanding of your own mind and your capabilities, it's how am I engaging with this so I am growing, not or I'm
Yeah.
growing rather than shrinking. How am I being thoughtful or enabling thoughtful practices of a costly tool against resources. You know, these are questions that could have been asked before AI has become so proliferate, but I think it's really forcing people's hands now.
Yeah.
So again, where did I leave things better than how I found them? Where did I again make something better because of an AI process that I enabled instead of again just kind of slapping it willy-nilly wherever it could go? I've worked on pieces of that where it's been successful. I've worked on pieces where it's still kind of to be proved out if that really was the case. And yeah, I'm curious to stay tuned, see kind of where this goes. I mean, and I'm
I know
enjoying
the
watching
Sam
the drama.
Altman
Not gonna lie.
case, the OpenAI case was very interesting. It's hard to root for two, I don't want to say villains, but like two less desirable people. But I was definitely on Sam Altman's side. I did not want Elon Musk to take over that company because I know it could be worse. I do love the idea that you just presented here of leave the world a better place than you found it. I think we try as humans to aspire to that. I don't think anybody is thinking burn the world down. It's a small percentage, obviously. You know, there's always a possibility, right? But I think in general, people want to do the best they can and then do the best they can for themselves, their family, and those around them. With AI, I think it's interesting because AI is a very, very powerful tool. And that's what it is. It's a tool. The issues with AI today are not necessarily with AI, but the implementation of AI, right? And there's a lot of people who want to profit as much as possible. And that's not necessarily leaving the world better than where they found it, right? So this amazing changing tool enables productivity. It helps us to do things faster. It removes repetition. It does a lot of it takes a lot of the cognitive load off when it comes to things that we don't need to, manage cycles on, like mental cycles on, which I appreciate. I think the problem is that, like you said, like, are we leaving the world in a better place? And right now I don't think so. Right. I just don't think the implementation of AI at this point is benefiting humanity as much as it is hurting it. I mean, we see the externalities of it, right? Like the data centers that are going up, the consumption of resources, all of these things are not necessarily, helping people out here, right? But it is a powerful tool that does powerful things, and it's not going to go away. I think that's the ultimate thing is we have to figure out how to utilize it in a way that makes the most sense for humanity and then, move forward with it. So yeah, at this point, I think I don't think there's any reason why you shouldn't adopt AI. I think you should. I think that every person should utilize it in some way. One thing that's interesting though is when you talked about how you can grow versus stagnate, and then right now it is really easy for it to do a lot of easy, what we would consider repetitive, easy tasks. In our specific case, like creating a PRD, right? Talking with Claude about like, hey, I've got these customers that I've interviewed and I've done these things, and here's the context, create a PRD and derive 5 interview questions I can ask, our stakeholders based on this next. Boom, does it in like minutes now, like seconds. So it's very quick. I think the part that where us as product managers really need to hold on to is the intelligence portion of it, right? Like we got to know the context. we're not going to know, like Claude's not going to know the why, right? Claude's not going to know why we're pursuing a specific business objective. Claude's not going to understand, why we have a very particularly ornery customer that wants a very specific feature, right? Like they don't know that unless we tell it to them. And if we are heavily relying on our ability just to spit out words, it's not going to be able to help us to build a better product. And that's where I'm like advocating the most when it comes to AI is like, are you just using it for productivity? Or are you using it to build consumer better products? And right now we're not at the point where we're actually building better consumer products. We're at the high productivity side, but we're not really building a better product. Has any of the AI products that you have used made it better for you in any of the things that you're doing? And if it does, like, are you paying for it? Because that's another thing, right? Like, are you paying cash for it? Or are you paying like having a data center in your backyard? But that's, is that convenience worth having something like that going on? Which I'm not against the data centers in general. I'm just saying, like, in order for it to get to the point where these corporate leaders are saying, like, they want to cover like 3/4 of the landmass in data centers or some sort of GPU technology, and that's not leaving a better place for all of us. So responsible use of AI and then responsible implementation to build better products, I think, is a corporate strategy that more of these leaders need to adopt, because it's not really making better consumer products.
Well, it gets back to, again, I think what we started the conversation with of like, what do you have control over? So again, going back to like your own personal usage of it, again, could be implementing that into your tool suite or even like building out something completely new. Is there, that like that example of like, hey, like create me a PRD. Was that like actually a quality output?
Oh,
Did
that's
you
a big
even
one.
read it?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it should be table stakes to just like edit it. I mean, I'm thinking back to a college English professor of mine that like sent me a scathing email back when I sent one with like a typo, and I never again was gonna send something I didn't read first. But again, that same kind of a piece, or that same like lens, like, okay, like I actually like engaged with this. This was like worth the output to that, like, that came back to me. I think another metaphor that like came to me as we were talking was like just this idea that like AI can really be a mirror. And if we almost look at it in kind of like the Portrait of Dorian Gray example, like it can really like what it's reflecting back of you, like that true intent. But like, hey, if you're learning, if that's in your heart and your mind and your soul, that will be reflected back to you in the output. That's a little more philosophical.
No, but
I
it
can have to
is
think
it
about
is
it that way.
100% true, because part of the reason why it's a very seductive technology, right? Like if it can
Yes.
speed up, I mean, let's take the college and the student perspective. If it can write a whole paper for you, with a couple of prompts, like that's incredibly seductive, right? And so I didn't
Of
have to put
course.
the effort in, I just did it. But then what happens to your understanding? Like it is like you're not reflecting back a deep well of, wisdom and intelligence here when you use like 4 sentences to create a 5-page paper, for instance. And that's not much different as adults. And especially as we move into this age where we are at the stage where we are, I would say, we're as formed as we're going to be, right? And even though we can grow and learn, everything is based on like our foundational experiences, and then moving on from there. But a child, for instance, who is growing up in this age, or a young person who's coming out of college, and they get AI and they start using it, and oh my gosh, I can do a bunch of things and not have to think about it. Like, again, that portrait is not reflecting back a deep well of wisdom and intelligence there. Like you're just offloading all that onto the AI because you're like, oh yeah, I'll take care of it for me, right? And that's not necessarily great either,
Yep.
obviously. And so one of the more fascinating things about like being an older person is that you have experience and you have knowledge, which then, and mix in that intelligence to create wisdom for you to make good choices later. And if we're offloading that too much on AI, that could be a big problem. And I think that, again, it's seductive even as adults to be able to shortcut things and be like, yeah, I just wrote this PRD, but I'm not going to read it. It's a very strong possibility that it could shape the way that that feature is made and then may not satisfy the intent of your stakeholders, right? Because you did not do it. Yeah. You did not put all that stuff together. You just used a couple of prompts, which is not enough to be able to manage those things, right? Yeah, great discussion, absolutely. Jenessa. Thank you very much for joining me here. That was really interesting. I learned a lot, and I love talking with people, especially with their different experiences, because obviously I don't know everything, right? And I haven't lived what you have lived and done what you have done. So it's really cool to be able to interchange with people and find out where they were. And so you brought up some really awesome points today. So thank you very much.
You're so welcome. It's always a pleasure to connect and chat.
All right. Well, thank you, Jenessa. It was a pleasure. Maybe we'll have you on again. I would love to have you on with Kyle so he can ask you some questions. Kyle has some very interesting and cool perspectives around project and product management that I love and I respect. So maybe we'll talk again soon. Maybe on your new adventure, whatever adventure you're on next, you'll be able to describe that pathway, and that'll be great.
I would love to. I'd love to be back.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And
You're so welcome.
Everyone, thank you for joining us for this conversation. Until next time.